I'm talking to you though. You're the stats guy.
Yeah, we're trying
You're the
to.
stats guy, and we're the homies.
What is up, homies? We are back with an interesting topic that's not really stats related. This is more of a follow up to my last video. If you watched my last video, which you definitely did not, because not even the two people who were the homies, Nikki and Greg, watched it. So yeah, you definitely didn't watch it. But if you did, you would know that I touched on betting and using my predictive algorithm, kind of live testing it with very low stakes to see if it worked. And I told you that up to that point, it sort of had been working. And it had been working with $1 bets. So betting about 10 games a day out of the 15. So about 75%. That's not 75%, about 67% of games, sometimes more, sometimes less, per day, based on the best odds I could get out of my algorithm. That is to say, the algorithm, not the best odds I could get for the games themselves, like on the sports book. There's a very distinct difference there because I'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, that is to say, I was just betting across the board, $1 every game, and every day I'd be up, about $1. And so that's pretty good. You bet $1 to win $1, and that's about a 10% profit. It seemed like pretty consistently. And so right after I dropped that video, I scaled to $10. And I thought that scaling would be a lot more helpful because instead of like trying to track the cents and stuff, it would just be a lot more clear if I lost money and if this was sustainable. As far as I can tell, it is sustainable. And that led me down a rabbit hole of the sports betting world, which is very interesting, very elusive world, I will say. Not a whole lot of like hard information to be found freely available. But I have learned some interesting things about that world that I wanted to talk about today. And one of the big things is I wanted to solicit people's advice about this stuff. Not that I'm going to take all like everybody's betting advice. I'm not definitely not going to change what I'm doing, but I do want to know people's opinions on basically whether or not I'm going to get banned at some point because I'll talk about it later in the video. But I'm up big. I'm up big and the stakes are really low, but percentage-wise, I'm up huge since 5 days ago when I started scaling. So we'll talk about how much I'm up and whether or not it's sustainable and whether or not a sportsbook would allow me to do this for a long period of time. I doubt it. Seems like, they're a business. And if someone's going to be making a living off of their business, that's just not going to be allowed. So I expect at some point you will be getting a video titled, I got banned. So there's that. But that being said, I'm doing things a lot differently. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm doing things a lot differently than your typical like professional gambler sports bettor would do. So let's talk about it. Let's get into it, dare I say. I want to start with a basic timeline. How much money I had in my account when I started and how much money I have in my account now. On June 24th, the morning of June 24th, before any games were played, I had $86.68 in my betting account. The evening of June 27th, after all the games had been played, I had $170.19. This is last night. So over those 4 days of games being played, June 24th, 25th, 26th, and 27th, I made about 96% profit, which is to say I very nearly doubled my money. There's a teeny tiny bit of a caveat. That percentage profit is not entirely accurate because I placed a bonus bet on this day and I placed another bonus bet on one of the other days too. So even if you subtract off 15%, I'm like at 80% profit or something like that. So, I mean, still pretty good. My strategy that I outlined in my last video had to do with probability thresholds. That strategy ends up not working out super duper well, mostly because, well, probabilities are harder to keep track of than simple predictions in terms of coding. So I decided I'll still keep track of them, but I'm not going to explicitly use them and only those games. And one of the main reasons is that you lose a lot of the games. Like only 20% or so of the games fall under those probability thresholds. So I decided, nah, that's kind of boring because the real goal, the real holy grail is not like betting on 5 sure wins a day. It's betting on like most of the games and trying to see if you can actually guess the outcomes of baseball games, right? That's what I want to do as a statistician. I can like obviously I could get up to like a 90% threshold if I just juice the probabilities and only take the games where like a 0.8 or a 0.9. Like that's how probabilities work. But I want to build a model that predicts every game with some accuracy. And it turns out that that's actually a lot better for betting because then you don't have to worry about odds necessarily. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, there's 3 things on the board right now. We're going to go through them all, but they're all interconnected into what I did and why it's working. Okay, so let's start with my assumption going into this entire process. The reason I only did dollar bets to begin with was because of this assumption. And that is that sports books are smarter than me. I thought for sure that not only would they be better at predicting games before they happen, but that they would, even if I could predict them better than the sports book itself, that they wouldn't give me enough money back per win in order to break even. This is how a lot of games in casinos work generally. And we're going to go back to my undergraduate degree in psychology and a class that I took in neuroeconomics that taught us this. Basically, humans are really bad at making decisions, especially when it comes to probabilities and money. If you've ever seen the like human probability expectation curve, it looks like an S, but the S is like tilted. So basically, what it amounts to is that anything between 20 and 80% probability, humans register as a coin flip. They register that there's no real difference between any of those probabilities, and they make decisions accordingly. Anything above 80%, they view as a sure thing. And anything below 20%, they view as a sure, like, loss, I guess. And so that's how humans are flawed. There's no way for humans to calculate in their heads quickly enough or accurately enough to realize that like a 0.5 probability on a $1,000 bet means that they're going to be winning on average $500 every time they do that. It's much easier for them to say like, oh, a 0.9 probability at $1,000, that's $1,000 guaranteed. When it's not, it's only $900 on average. So that's just like a very basic example of why I think what I'm doing is actually working better than I thought it would. Because I thought that, for instance, even if I was able to win 6 or 7 out of 10 games, that my returns on those games would not be enough to make up the losses from the other 3 or 4 games. Because when you win 6 games, you have to make up, in my case, $40. So the winnings on the 6, let's say it's the odds are such that you win $5 after betting 10, you get a total payout of $15. That your winnings accrued have to account for more than $40, and if you want profit, they have to account for like $40 plus, 41, 42. That's how you get profit. That's what I thought. I thought that they were going to game the odds so that the math didn't math. But I was wrong about that. In fact, a 60% win rate, which is exactly what my algorithms tested at. And in fact, they've been overperforming just a little bit. And I'll talk about why I think they're overperforming now as opposed to during the testing cycle. But my algorithms are all very consistently at 60% or above. And that is enough at exactly 60% to make just about 10 bucks. And it depends on the day. It depends on the odds of those specific games and whether or not, certain games win or certain games lose. But it's very consistent. And it was very surprising to me that that was the case because yesterday, no, 2 days ago, I had my most average day that I could possibly expect. I bet on 10 games. I won 6 of them. I thought before this experiment that even if I was able to do that, even if I was able to hit the nail right on the head and do exactly what the testing and my expectations were at 60%, I would break even or lose money. And that the sports book would be betting that my algorithm was slightly underperforming from what they tested at, and that I would, on average, lose money over time. But that's not the case. At a 60% win rate, you make about a unit of betting. So in my case, 10 bucks. That was the most surprising thing to me of all. Because then I thought, are people really not able to predict baseball games with 60% accuracy? As I went through in my last video, 60% accuracy is super low for statistics. In fact, I think that if I had access to, like, let's say all of the information that a professional baseball team has, I would be able to get to much closer to 70%. Much closer. Obviously, I don't have access to all that. Injury information, specific lineup information. Like, for instance, your lineup today might have an average OPS of, pick a number, 500, and your lineup tomorrow might have an average OPS of 550. And if I could take that information into account, it'd probably be a game changer. In fact, if I could take into account, like, if we had an expectation of which bullpen guys were going to be used in that game, which starters were going to be used in that game, because the algorithms I'm currently using are very basic in that regard. I do take pitchers into account. I take their whips from the previous season. Why? Well, because coding wise, it's super easy to do. I can just create a data frame with all the previous whips. I can create a data frame with all the names of the pitchers, and then bada bing, bada boom. Every game has a previous whip column for every pitcher, and I can use that. That is to say, this is not as good as I could get. If I was doing this full time, I would be able to get a much higher win rate. But then you come into issues with the sports book itself, and that is because they're business, like I mentioned before. I imagine right now, with the very low stakes I'm putting on each game, and with the relatively low win rate and the really slim profit margin, I'm flying way under the radar. I'm sure there's guys making a lot more money. However, I don't think that they're making money in the same way that I am. Okay, but before I get into that, let's talk about this. This is an epidemiological thing. I say that because biostatisticians, which is what I was formerly trained in, typically don't use contingency tables quite as much as epidemiologists. I will say, though, that for the purposes of logistic regression in general, because it's binary, you have binary outcomes, and for the purposes of, like, producing a confusion matrix, which is what this is called, this is the simplest way to conceptualize exactly what's happening with my algorithms. So at the top, you have predicted win-loss, and on the side, you have true win-loss. So this is obviously after the fact, but the predicted is using information that's available before the game started. Okay, so then you have these cells A, B, C, and D. In my last video, I thought that my big breakthrough was going to be the probability threshold thing, where I only bet on games where the probabilities were high enough that I felt comfortable saying this is going to have a really high win rate, so I should probably bet on that. Instead, what ended up being the breakthrough was something that you learn in Epidemiology 101 or Biostats 101, which is predicted value positive and predictive value negative. Now, these are typically used in the context of a test. So, like, let's take, for example, a COVID test. If you take a COVID test and it's positive, then you would you could look up the statistics for that specific test and you could say, how sure am I that my positive test is really a positive test? In our context, it's how sure am I that a predicted win is really going to be a win? You take this divided by the sum of these and you get a percentage, and that percentage tells you how well your test is at predicting true positives. On the flip side, if you got a negative COVID test, you could look up the statistics and you could do this calculation. So you would do D over D plus C, and you would find your predicted value negative, and it's a percentage. And then you would see, well, how good is my test at predicting true negatives? In my case, and I'm not entirely sure why, I could speculate about it, but to be honest, I haven't thought about it enough. My algorithms are much better at predicting true wins than they are true losses. It's important for me at this point to mention to you how I'm coding my data. My data is all coded from the perspective of the home team. So when I enter my data, team is the home team, opponent is the away team. And so, for instance, if I don't put any variables into the model, if I use an intercept only logistic regression model, you get a win rate of 55%. And I talked about that last video too, because 55% is simply the rate at which home teams win at home. And so you're already starting off on a good foot. And that's why I use this coding, because you get that 5% boost without doing anything. And then you just kind of build on from there. But basically what I have learned is that bad teams, and this is not surprising at all, but bad teams win at home randomly more often than bad teams win away. And that makes perfect sense. The crowd's on your side, you're home, you don't have to travel, you don't have to stay in a hotel. There's a ton of variables that go into home and away. But that makes a lot of sense. And what I've been finding consistently over and over and over is even if the opponent, the away team, has a really good like expected runs or even expected win probability, the likelihood that they're going to win on the road is just way lower than the likelihood that they're going to win at home. And again, that's to be expected. But basically what I've done now is instead of betting on every single game, including the home losses, I am only betting on the home wins. So I am only betting if my algorithm says, yes, that team's going to win, right? That team being the home team, because that's every team is home in my data. Now it's time to speculate. When I was doing research, I read a bunch of articles, every article I pretty much could, which was not a lot. There's a lot of sites that make you pay for articles like this, which is silly, but whatever. And then just like forums online, Reddit, that type of stuff, which I definitely take with a huge grain of salt. There are a lot of people who are really salty on those forums who like have definitely lost a lot of money betting, and they're like, nothing works. And okay, for most people, I don't think anything works. Okay, but when it comes to professional gamblers, that is to say, people who report making a living gambling on sports games, there are basically two like strategies that I just kept coming across. One of them was arb betting, or arbitrage betting, I think is what it stands for, and that's where you use software or you just do it yourself. You look at two different sports books and you see, like, for instance, if in a certain game, like let's say the Washington Nationals were playing the Phillies, and on one sports book the Nationals had plus odds, and on one sports book the Phillies had plus odds, and you bet $10 on each game, you're guaranteed I don't know, 50 cent, maybe $1 profit on those if the odds are both plus. And so that's one way to definitely make a profit. There's no risk if you're doing it correctly. And betting sites really don't like that kind of thing, obviously, because you're basically exploiting a loophole. You're not correctly guessing a game. You're just betting both sides and knowing that you're going to come out on top. So those people get banned, it seems like, pretty frequently. Um, yeah, which is funny because it seems like sportsbooks don't really talk to each other unless it's to like weed out these types of people. And the next one is these stale line people. I'm, to be honest with you, I'm still not 100% sure what this means. Um, but I know that it has to do a lot with like prop bets where people are like, for instance, if they find a prop bet that again is just a mistake in the sports book, like I don't know, Jonas Valanciunas is going to have 2 rebounds, like over under rebounds. Well, if you hammer the over right before the game starts and the line hasn't moved, you're going to win that bet because he's going to get more than 2 rebounds. But again, this is more like a mistake by the sports book. And so you're basically betting on loopholes. And I have not found a professional bettor who is posting on these sites. Now, to be fair, they might exist. They're just not posting or writing articles. But I've not found anyone that's just like, I just know who's going to win on the games by one method or another. They are all like doing this weird loophole thing where they're trying to get an edge on the sports book by exploiting information they have or exploiting the sports book lack of attention to detail and then winning money that way. And that doesn't seem sustainable at all. And those people tend to get banned. I mean, it seems like the sports books are pretty good at catching these types of people and getting them off the site. Okay, before I speculate on why I think that what I'm doing might be more sustainable than what these people are doing, I want to talk about loyalties and odds. I think, and I could be wrong, but I think that sports books are betting overwhelmingly that you are gonna put down money with your gut and not with your head. And I think that that's overwhelmingly true. And that has to do with loyalties. So I'm a Cowboys fan. If you've watched any of my videos, which you have not, because my YouTube videos have so few likes and comments and views. Like, seriously. You can't call yourself a homie if you don't watch. Greg. Freaking one of the homies himself doesn't even watch the videos. And I doubt Nikki does either. Fake. Anyways, we all have our loyalties. If I'm going into a Cowboys game, I'm thinking, man, we have a good chance to win, right? I'm just spinning the narrative in my head that we're going to win. Nikki's doing the same thing with the Cardinals. And at least in my case, it ends up being true more often than not in the last couple of years. And in Nikki's case, she's just dumb. But I think that sportsbooks are really betting that you're not gonna look at the games objectively. And so I think one of the reasons that my algorithm has been successful and my strategy has been successful thus far is because I don't have any loyalty when it comes to putting down money. I just put down whatever the algorithm says. Like, I don't discriminate. And I think that even that small change is enough to flip the odds in your favor, potentially. And the other thing is odds. When I came into this, I thought that odds were going to be my downfall. Like, even if I predicted games at a high rate, that they were just going to be such heavy favorites that I'd only win $1, $2 on every game. And it wouldn't be enough to cover my losses. And that would be that. And the experiment would be over. And I would just make a video about I was able to correctly predict, but it didn't go anywhere. And that's how the world works. But it didn't. And instead, I'm making money. And now we're going to get into like real speculative mathematical territory. Right now, I'm definitely flying under the radar. I'm doing $10 bets. They're still giving me bonus bets, and I'm up big on them. Like, they are fairly certain that I, as an individual user, will be losing all of this money at some point, right? I might be on a hot streak right now. And to be fair, the algorithm is definitely on a hot streak. It's performing better than the tests. I'll talk about that at the end. But the odds aren't so skewed that you can't turn a profit. So basically, how the math works out is if I am at exactly 60% on every win, I need to make back $6.70, 2/3, on average to break even. That's my break even number. On wins so far, I am making on average back about $8, which means that my expected like net return is plus $1.30, which means that I'm making $1.30 on average for every time I win. And $1.30 times 6 is just about $10. So all the math is working out in my favor. And I suppose what the sportsbooks are saying is like, you might be an aberration. You might be able to correctly predict 6 out of 10 games. But the average person is only going to be able to predict 5 out of 10. And at a 50% win rate, you're down money. And the margins are really slim, but the end result is huge. If I was only making 50% wins, even if I had the same return on every win, I'd be down about $15, not just 10. I'd be down about $15. So you get dinged a lot more for losing below that like break even point of like between 55 and 60% than you do profit off being above that break even point. And that's why these sports books exist in the first place, because I I have seen that win rates of anywhere between 55% and 50% could be profitable if you use like some of these other methods. But I've never seen somebody who's like, oh, my win rate is just 65%, and that's how I make money. I don't know if people do that, but I don't think they do. Um, One of the only in-depth conversations I've seen on this particular topic was on Joe Rogan, and can't remember the guy's name, but he was a professional sports bettor, and even he, who has like this professional operation and undoubtedly makes a ton of money doing this stuff, um, said that what they do is they calculate the lines themselves, and then they see what the sports books have the lines at, and then they bet against the lines if the lines are off from what they calculate, I guess. So in essence, they are doing the exact same thing that the sports books are doing. They're calculating lines, and then they're betting on the discrepancies between their calculations and the sportsbook calculations. And in my head, that's just another like loophole way of making money, which is fine if it works. But I was really disappointed to find out that like when you dig into this stuff, you don't find a lot of people who are good at predicting the outcomes of games. You find none of those people. You only find people who are trying to exploit some sort of a loophole in the sports book. And to be honest with you, I wanted like a tidbit about how I could maybe improve my algorithm, or maybe get um or maybe swing another 2 or 3% out of what I'm currently getting. And it's just not really out there. I don't know if it's because people have come to the conclusion that it's not profitable, or if people are unsuccessful in the first place, like they're not able to successfully predict at a rate that's high enough like I am. I don't know if my predictions are going to be sustainable, to be honest with you. I'm probably going to keep doing this until the end of the baseball season. And like unless my account goes to zero, in which case I'm not putting any more money into this. But yeah, I'm probably going to just continue doing exactly what I'm doing, betting $10 every day. And if at the end of it I'm way up, I think it'll warrant a much deeper discussion about this topic. Um, but I think that I'm sort of lost in the crowd. And also one of the things I came across was if you're simply betting money lines or just betting on like individual games and you're doing it correctly, you might actually be making the sports book more money than you're losing it, because if they identify that you're an accurate bettor, their algorithms will use your pick to tweak their lines. And then it gets into the last thing I want to talk about, which is like the crux of how the sports books get you. So, not only do odds make it more difficult for you to win money on what you perceive to be a sure thing, because if you have a lock, quote unquote, and the sports book agrees with you, they're not going to give you very much. Like, you're going to have to bet a ton of money just to win a little. But the other thing that it does is that odds are a two-way street. So when one team is plus, the other team is typically minus. Now, close games, both teams are minus. So no matter what you do, you're going to lose money, theoretically. And that's another way the sportsbook gets you. But when the underdog is really plus, now in your head you're thinking, well, my risk is really low and my reward is high. And I can bet $10 to win 20 or bet $10 to win 30. And so they incentivize choosing the team where the probability of winning is so low that even if 1 out of 10 of those games do hit for the underdog, it doesn't matter because the sportsbook has taken your money on the other 9, and that's fine. And it could be that as an individual user, I am flying under the radar and I'm the 1 in 10 and everybody else is the 9 in 10, and they're okay if I make a profit, even a big profit over a long period of time, because everybody else is losing. And based on my predictions, they're going to lose even more, because if I pick the Phillies over the Nationals, they know, this guy has an idea about the Phillies are going to win. Everybody else is betting, like, we want to make everybody else bet the Nationals. So let's move the line. Let's incentivize people to bet the Nationals. And when the Phillies win, I win a little, they lose a lot. That might be more valuable to the sports book than them giving me money every day, if that makes sense. I'm going to end with the section that typically ends all papers if you are looking at like research literature, and that is the limitations section. This has been a 4-day so far experiment. It was a lot longer than that with the $1 thing, but in terms of scaling and actually seeing, like, I guess I didn't realize even when I was up $1 a day, it just didn't seem like it seemed like, yeah, this is up, but then every 10th day I'd lose $1 and I'd be like, yeah, this doesn't really work. And it wasn't until I like went back in time and just literally did plus minus where was I to start and where did I end up, to be like, oh, over a month this seems to be up, and not up a little, up a good percentage. So then I scaled, and I've had a couple of really good days. On June 24th, when I had $86 in my account, that day alone I had a profit of plus 50. I ended the day with 130 some dollars in the account, and I was like, whoa, that's obviously a very good day. It's an aberration. It's not something that I'm going to ever expect. On the flip side of that, yesterday I had the worst day I've ever had, of the 4. I was 3 for 7, which is like 43%. And, I lost more games than I won. Not a good day. And I was down $2. That's it. On $10 bets, losing, I was down $2. So my worst days, not bad. And my good days are awesome. You might be listening to me thinking, well, I'm becoming a degenerate gambler, basically. I'll give you a couple quotes. My girlfriend said, "You sound like a degenerate gambler." Probably do. My brother said it's fun to watch the evolution of a degenerate gambler. And yet, at the end of it, I don't really feel like I'm betting for two reasons. One, I have no skin in the game. I'm not quitting my day jobs. I have several. I'm not going to put any sort of real money. I have decided that I put $100 into this. That's as much as I'm willing to bet, at least on this season. If I lose $100 a year on a silly experiment, that's fine. It's basically like an entertainment hobby for me. Um, but on the other hand, it doesn't feel like I'm gambling at all because all of my picks have been generated not by me but by a calculator. And so I'm removing my own bias from the equation, theoretically, hopefully. So that's where I've landed. At the end of all this, I'm up money. I'm not willing to put any more. I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to see if over a longer sample size than 4 days, if this keeps going up and up, or if at some point I plateau, or if at some point I start taking a nosedive. The last thing I wanted to mention is something that I talked about before, which is why my algorithm seems to be improving. So in all the testing, I tested on the first 800 games of this season. And I used data from 2,000 games from last season to build the algorithm. That's where the coefficients come from, is from last season. And then I used this season as a testing data set. And the first 800 or so games tested all at around 60%, very consistently 60%. But the last 200 or so games have been closer to 65% with the same algorithm. Why is that? Okay, so in biostatistics and particularly in clinical trials. Now, clinical trials are a very special case. But in clinical trials, you will sometimes have what's called a run-in period. A run-in period basically means that if you're testing a drug, you give that drug to a person, like let's say you start giving it to them a week before the actual data collection begins, because it might take a week or longer, depending on the drug, that long to start manifesting biological measurable differences. So you don't want to take those first 7 days into account because they might not be any different from baseline because the drug just hasn't taken effect. Some of the stats I'm using, in particular Pythagorean win-loss percentage, which I went over last time, get better over time. And by that I mean, after the first game, maybe you scored 10 runs. And then let's say over the next 3 or 4 games, you don't score a run at all. You get shut out 4 games in a row. But the algorithm thinks that you're scoring 10 runs a game for the next game. And for the game after that, they think you score 5 runs a game. And the game after that, they think you score 20 yards or two runs a game, something like that. That's not accurate, though, necessarily. And so my run-in period that I decided on was 10 games. After 10 games, then I'm comfortable making a prediction because, that's a big enough sample size for me to stomach. Should I probably do something more? Well, yeah. And that's probably why the first part of the season was only 60% accurate, because these teams were all still in the process of regressing to the mean, regressing to their true something, equating a true expected run potential. And as the season goes on, their mean is set in stone, and it's probably not going to change very much. It's probably going to be very stable for games 1,000 to 2,000. And so half of the data that this data set comes from, or that these coefficients come from, are in that 1000 to 2000 game range. So the coefficients I'm currently using are probably better in the back half. Although Greg has pointed out something very interesting, which is the trade deadline. The trade deadline presents a very interesting problem for the algorithm because theoretically, with new players, your mean changes. The runs you are expected to score change based on your roster. And so one of two things could happen. One is, as all these trades begin to happen, once the trade deadline passes, the algorithm might need time to calibrate. I might hit a plateau. I might even hit a bad streak after the trade deadline. Because even though it's taking into account all the previous games of the season, their actual mean runs versus runs scored calculation has changed. The algorithm doesn't really know that. There's no way to well, there's probably a way to take it into account, but I'm not going to because that's way too much work. But it could go the other way because good teams are typically buyers and bad teams are typically sellers. So if you have a higher Pythagorean win-loss, it might only increase, like it might only accentuate that high Pythagorean win-loss. Whereas if you have a low one, you're probably a seller and you might get rid of a good player or two, and that's going to go down. And so the discrepancy between the two, like if a good team plays a bad team, instead of the algorithm thinking that it's this close, it might be this close, and you might get a 0.51 probability saying like this team's probably going to win, but in reality it might be a 0.55. But that doesn't matter for the prediction because I already predicted a win, so it just improves my odds, I guess. This is all a lot to think about. It's yet to be seen. It's why I'm doing the experiment, because all this stuff is so interesting. When you're following the season like I am, which is to say not watching any baseball, definitely not watching any baseball, but you're keeping track of these different variables. Stats nerd, it adds a layer of complexity to the whole thing, where it's like the games are being played, the narratives are being told, but what's going on underneath? So it's all very interesting. Obviously, I have a lot to say on the topic. Our next video is going to be on the 4th of July. We are hoping we're definitely gonna do a baseball video for that day because baseball stats are the coolest stats of all the teams. So we're gonna do something fun with that. I think that's all I wanted to say. If you guys are interested in this stuff at all, please comment questions, comments, things that I have not taken into account. As I mentioned last video that you didn't watch, I'm very new to the world of betting, and whether or not I'm going to be banned is like, I kind of hope I'm going to be banned because one, then I could stop this like delusion that like, oh, I could just like make money, like have an extra $100 every month. Like that'd be kind of cool. That's not a healthy way to think. And two, I could then make content about it and be like, oh, I broke the sports books and my algorithm's just too good. But it is reassuring to know that like the stuff that I'm doing right now is definitely working right now, and it could very well get a lot better in the future. So yeah, it's all interesting stuff. And so if you have an angle that I haven't considered, or a variable that you think might play more into this that would be easy to capture and I could easily add into this stuff, that would be great. But I think that's all for today, and I will see you guys on the 4th of July. Have a good one.